There are 39 swords in Blox Fruits, and in this video I'll be giving the pros and cons on every single sword. There will be timestamps for each sword, and without wasting more time, let's begin. The Katana is a beginner first C sword, and can be purchased for 1000 money. Pros of this sword are that it's very cheap and has low mastery requirements, making it a good beginner sword. Cons of this sword are that it has very low damage and all the moves don't break instinct. Overall this sword is decent, although it has very low damage, it's insanely cheap, so you can't really complain. The Cutlass is a beginner first C sword, and can be bought for 1000 money. Pros of this sword are that it's very cheap and has low mastery requirements, it's basically the exact same as the Katana but reskinned. Cons of this sword are that it doesn't break instinct and does very low damage. Overall this sword is decent, it does very low damage, but similar to Katana, it's insanely cheap so you can't really complain. The Dual Katana is a first C sword, and can be bought for 12,000 money. Pros of this sword are that it's relatively cheap, and low mastery requirements. Cons of this sword are that it has pretty long cooldowns for a weak weapon, does low damage, and doesn't break instinct. Overall this sword is bad, it's not worth the cost and you're better off getting something like the Katana/Cutlass. The Iron Mace is a first C sword, and can be bought for 25,000 money. Pros of this sword are that it has decent M1, low mastery requirements, and does decent damage. Cons of this sword are that it's close ranged, and the moves aren't that good. Overall this sword is mediocre, the sword is quite costly and isn't worth it in my opinion. The Triple Katana is a first C sword, and can be bought for 60,000 money. Pros of this sword are that the X move is good AoE, and it's pretty good for beginners because it does decent damage. Cons of this sword are that the Z move has high knockback making it bad for grinding, and for 60,000 money it has bad price to performance. Overall this sword is bad, for 60,000 money it's not worth it, you're better off using the Iron Mace or something. The Shark Saw is a first C sword, and can be obtained by defeating the Saw boss. Pros of this sword are that it's longer than most swords, meaning the range is higher than usual, allowing you to hit NPCs while they can hit you. The moves are also pretty decent as they have good AoE and a stun effect. Cons of this sword are that it has low M1 damage, but other than that there's no other cons. Overall this sword is fine, it is good range and the moves have good stun and mediocre damage. The Twin Hooks is a third C sword, and has a chance to be obtained by defeating the Captain Elephant boss. Pros of this sword are that it does great damage, has a fast attack speed, and the Z move has good stun. Cons of this sword are that the moves don't break instinct, and the moves have short range and require decent aim. Overall this sword is fine, it does good damage and has a fast attack speed, but the moves are hard to hit. The Pipe is a first C sword, and can be bought for 100,000 money. Pros of this sword are that it does decent damage, and the X move has a large AoE which can hit many enemies. Cons of this sword are that all the moves have knockback which can make it bad for grinding, and it has a slow M1 attack speed. Overall this sword is fine, it's a bit costly but it does good damage and the moves are also pretty good. The Warden Sword is a first C sword, and has a chance to be obtained by defeating the Chief Warden boss. Pros of this sword is that it's a bit longer than other swords giving it more reach, so you can hit NPCs without them being able to hit you. And all of the moves have a stun effect and good AoE. Cons of the sword are that the Z move is short ranged, all the moves have high knockback making it bad for grinding, and the M1 damage is quite low. Overall this sword is fine, it is good range but all the moves have high knockback. The Soul Cane is a first C sword, and can be bought for 750,000 money. Pros of this sword are that all the moves have a stun effect, the Z move can break instinct hockey, and the moves are pretty fast paced. Cons of this sword are that it's very expensive for a first C sword, costing 750,000 money, and the X move can be instinct tricked. Overall this sword is good, it's very costly but it's a very good PvP sword. The Trident is a first C sword, and has a chance to be obtained by defeating the Fishman Lord boss. Pros of this sword are that all the moves have good AoE, the Z move can be used for mobility, the X move breaks instinct hockey, and does decent damage. Cons of this sword are that the X move has high knockback, and it has pretty short range. Overall this sword is good, it does good damage and the moves have good AoE. The dual-headed blade is a first C sword, and can be bought for 400,000 money. Pros of this sword are that all the moves have good AoE, does fine damage, and the Z move can be used for mobility. Cons of this sword are that have relatively high cooldowns, and quite expensive. Overall this sword is fine, the moves have decent AoE and the sword does good damage, but it just isn't worth the cost. The Longsword is a second C sword, and has a chance to be obtained by defeating the Diamond boss. Pros of this sword are that the Z move breaks instinct Haki, and all the moves have decent AoE. Cons of this sword are that the moves are short-ranged and have pretty long cooldowns, and the damage is pretty mid. Overall this sword is mid, it is good AoE, but the damage isn't that good and the moves are short-ranged. The Gravity Cane is a second C sword, and has a chance to be obtained by defeating the Fajita boss. Pros of this sword are that it does high damage, it's really good for PvP as all the moves have a bit of stun, and all the moves are multi-target. Cons of this sword are that the X move can be instinct tricked, and the range on the moves is pretty short. Overall this sword is great, it does high damage, great for PvP as it has good combo potential, and the moves are all multi-target. The Jitte is a second C sword, and has a chance to be obtained by defeating the Smoke Admiral boss. Pros of this sword are that the moves have decent range, and the X move breaks instinct Haki and can be used for mobility. Cons of this sword are that it does low damage, has bad combo potential and is weak for air PvP. Overall this sword is mid, it does low damage making it bad for both PvP and grinding. The Dragon Trident is a second C sword, and has a chance to be obtained by defeating the Tidekeeper boss. Pros of this sword are that it does high damage, it has a bit higher hitbox than other swords, and all the moves can break instinct. All the moves also have very high AoE, the X move having the largest sword AoE in the entire game, and it stuns enemies. Cons of this sword are that the Z move has very high knockback making it annoying for grinding. Overall this is a great sword, it's very good for both PvP and grinding, the moves have great AoE and do good damage. The Bisento is a first C sword, and can be bought for 1 million money. Pros of this sword are that it does high damage, all the moves have good AoE, and the X move can break instinct Haki. Cons of this sword are that getting Bisento V2 is pretty hard, as you have to defeat the Greybeard boss who spawns every 6 hours. It's also very expensive for a first C sword, costing 1 million money. But it is legendary rarity I guess. Overall this sword is good, it's pretty underrated for PvP but pretty expensive, so I wouldn't recommend buying it if you're in the first C. The Pole Sword is a first C sword, and has a chance to be obtained by defeating the Thunder God boss. Pros of this sword are that it does decent damage, and the range is slightly longer than other swords making it decent for grinding too. The moves also have decent stun. Cons of this sword are that the M1 attack is pretty slow, the Z move has a pretty long cast delay, and the moves have a small AoE. Overall this sword is pretty bad, it's trash for PvP, the M1 attack is slow, however the damage and range is pretty decent, but to be honest this sword shouldn't be a legendary rarity. The Saber is a first C sword, and can be obtained by completing the Saber puzzle and then defeating the Saber expert boss. Pros of this sword are that it does great damage, and is great for both grinding, PvP, and C event hunting. Saber V2, the moves also have good range, and AoE. Cons of this sword are that this sword only gets good after getting it to V2, and the moves have severe end lag which can be bad for low-end devices. Overall this sword is excellent, it's great for PvP, grinding, and C event hunting, it does great damage, and the moves have good AoE. The Pole, second form, is a second/third C sword, depends when you obtain it. You can obtain this sword by first getting Pole, first form, to 180 or higher mastery, fully awaken Rumble and get it to 250 plus mastery, then do an additional Rumble raid to buy Pole V2 for 5,000 fragments. Pros of this sword are that it has high stun and does good damage, good for C event hunting and PvP, and all the moves break instinct Haki in a decent range. Cons of this sword are that it's hard, expensive, and time-consuming to obtain, and the M1 attacks are quite slow. Overall this sword is good, it's good for both PvP and grinding, and does good damage, but it is quite hard and expensive to get. The Koko is a second C sword, and has a chance to be obtained by defeating the Order boss. Pros of this sword are that it does good damage, it has a fast M1 attack, the Z move has a bit of stun, and it has decent combo potential for PvP. Cons of this sword are that it can be very expensive, in fragments, to obtain if you have bad luck, and the moves need a bit of aiming skills if you want a PvP. Overall this sword is good, it does good damage, decent for PvP, and has fast M1 attacks, but the sword can be quite costly to obtain. The Midnight Blade is a 2nd C sword, and can be bought for 100 ectoplasm. Pros of this sword are that it does high damage, has good stun, and it has good combo potential making it good for PvP. Also this pro isn't really important, but the visual effects on this sword is insane. In my opinion the moves are the best visually looking in the game. Cons of this sword are that it has pretty short range, and the moves can be easily instinct tricked. Overall this sword is good, it does good damage, and it's pretty cheap to get, however it's pretty weak for long range. The Rengoku is a 2nd C sword, and has a chance to be obtained by defeating the Awakened Ice Admiral boss. Pros of this sword are that it does very great damage, and all the moves break instinct hockey and have good AoE. Cons of this sword are that the Z move is single target, and this sword is pretty hard to get. Overall this sword is great, it does great damage, pretty good combo potential, good for grinding, however, it is pretty hard to get. The Wando is a 2nd C sword, and is one of the 3 special legendary swords. It can be bought for 2 million money. Pros of this sword are that it does high damage, is great for grinding in PvP, and the Z move has good stun. Cons of this sword are that it's insanely hard to get, and combos with this sword require skill. Overall this sword is good, it does high damage, is pretty good for grinding because of the moves, however it's very hard and time consuming to get. The Shisui is a 2nd C sword, and is one of the 3 special legendary swords. It can be bought for 2 million money. Pros of this sword are that the X move has insane range, it's good for both PvP, grinding, and C event hunting, and the moves are multi-target. Cons of this sword are that the moves don't break instinct hockey, and has small hitboxes. Overall this sword is good, the moves have long range, good combo potential, and deals good damage, however this sword is very hard and time consuming to get. The Saddi is a 2nd C sword, and is one of the 3 special legendary swords. It can be bought for 2 million money. Pros of this sword are that it does good damage, has good combo potential making it good for PvP, and it's pretty good for C event hunting. Cons of this sword are that the moves have insane knockback making them bad for grinding, and both skills can be instinct tricked. Overall this sword is fine, it does good damage and has pretty good combo potential, but it's pretty hard to get and in my opinion it's the worst out of the 3 special legendary swords. The Yama is a 3rd C sword, and can be obtained after defeating around 30 elite pirates and then obtaining it at the secret area at Hydra Island. The Yama is a 3rd C sword, and can be obtained after defeating around 30 elite pirates and then obtaining it at the secret area at Hydra Island. Cons of this sword are that the moves have insane knockback making it bad for grinding, and pretty low damage compared to other 3rd C swords. Overall this sword is good, it has great mobility, good for PvP, and the moves have good AoE. However the moves have high knockback making it bad for grinding. The Shark Anchor is a 3rd C sword, and can be obtained by defeating an anchored, irregular, terror shark. Pros of this sword are that it does high damage, the Z move has insane AoE, both moves breaks instinct hockey, and both moves are multi-target with good stun. All of those pros make it great for PvP, grinding, and C event hunting. Cons of this sword are that the M1 has a slow attack speed, and both moves have some knockback making them annoying for grinding. Overall this sword is excellent, it's good for grinding and PvP, does high damage, and combos with this sword are pretty easy to learn. The Dark Dagger is a 3rd C sword, and has a chance to be obtained by defeating the Ripindra raid boss, 3rd C version. Pros of this sword are that it has very good combo potential making it good for PvP, has a fast M1 attack speed, and the Z move breaks instinct hockey. Cons of this sword are that it's very hard to obtain, both moves are single target making it bad for grinding, and the sword requires some skill to use for PvP. Overall this sword is good, it's great for PvP, but bad for grinding due to the moves being single target and having pretty high knockback. The Fox Lamp is a 3rd C sword, and has a chance to be obtained after donating 15 plus Azure Embers to the Kitsune Shrine. Pros of this sword are that it does high damage, both moves have great AoE, breaks instinct hockey, has good stun, and can damage sea beasts. Cons of this sword are that it can be hard to obtain as it's luck based, The Z move is single target, making it bad for grinding, and the moves require decent aim skills for PvP. Overall this sword is great, it does great damage, good for PvP, grinding, and C event hunting, and both moves can break instinct haki. The Spikey Trident is a 3rd C sword, and has a chance to be obtained by defeating the Cake Prince or the Do King boss. Pros of this sword are that it does high damage, both moves can be used for mobility, both moves have good stun, and is also great for PvP for its combo potential. Cons of this sword are that the moves can be instinct tricked, has a slow M1 attack speed, both moves require good aim for PvP and are single target, making it bad for grinding. Overall this sword is great, it's one of the best and most popular swords for PvPing, it does high damage, and both moves can be used for mobility. The Canvander is a 3rd C sword, and has a chance to be obtained after defeating the beautiful pirate boss. Pros of this sword are that it does high damage, and both moves can be used for mobility. Cons of this sword are that both moves don't break instinct haki, and it's pretty hard to get as the beautiful pirate boss is a hard boss to defeat. Overall this sword is fine, it is good mobility and damage, but other than that it has no other benefits. The Buddy Sword is a 3rd C sword, and has a chance to be obtained after defeating the Cake Queen boss. Pros of this sword are that it does high damage, both moves are fast paced, the X move breaks instinct haki, and good for PvP due to its combo potential. Cons of this sword are that both moves have insane knockback, making this sword bad for grinding, the Z move is single target and close ranged, and the moves require good aim. Overall this sword is fine to bad, it's only good for PvP, and bad for grinding and C event hunting, as only one move can damage a sea beast. The Tushita sword is a 3rd C sword, and can be obtained by completing the Tushita puzzle then defeating the Longma boss. Pros of this sword are that both moves can break instinct haki, good combo potential making it good for PvP, and both moves have decent AoE with low knockback making it good for grinding. Cons of this sword are that both moves can be instinct tricked, and the moves are pretty short ranged. Overall this sword is great, it's good for both PvP and grinding, but it's pretty hard to get. The Dark Blade is one of the 5 mythical swords in the game, and can be obtained by buying it for 1,200 Robux in the shop or trading for it. Pros of this sword are that it does high damage, great for C event hunting, very low mastery requirements for a mythical sword, and the Z move can break instinct haki. It also has great combo potential making it a popular and great choice for PvP, and the moves do high damage with not that much knockback making it great for grinding too. Cons of this sword are that it's expensive to obtain, and most free-to-play players will never get it unless they trade for it, which would be like a few kitsunes or something. Overall this sword is excellent, it's great in C event hunting, PvP, and grinding, the only downside being it's expensive to obtain. The True Triple Katana is one of the 5 mythical swords in the game, and can be obtained after getting the 3 special legendary swords to 300 plus mastery, then you can buy the True Triple Katana for 2 million money. Pros of this sword are that it does high damage, it has a fast M1 attack speed, decent combo potential, and good for C event hunting. Cons of this sword are that it's insanely hard to get, being arguably the hardest sword to obtain in the entire game, and this sword is pretty bad for grinding as the moves have high knockback. Both moves can also be instinct tricked and easily dodged. Overall this sword is good, it's decent for PvP and C event hunting, but bad for grinding and it's very hard and expensive to get. The Hallow Scythe is one of the 5 mythical swords, and has a very low chance to be obtained after defeating the Soul Reaper boss. Pros of this sword are that it has a fast M1 attack speed, the X move can be used for mobility and breaks instinct haki, and the Z move has good stun and hitbox. All the moves are also multi-target, making this sword good for grinding, and it has decent combo potential making it decent for PvP. Cons of this sword are that it's very hard to obtain, luck dependent, it deals the lowest M1 damage out of all the mythical swords, and the X move requires good aim to use in PvP. Overall this sword is good, it's decent for PvP and grinding. Both moves are multi-target, and the X move can be used for mobility, however, it's pretty hard to get and the M1 damage is pretty low. The Cursed Dual Katana, CDK for short, is one of the 5 mythical swords, and can be obtained by completing the Cursed Dual Katana puzzle. Pros of this sword are that it does extremely high damage, and has very good combo potential, one of, if not the most popular sword choice for PvP. Both moves can also break Instinct Haki. The X move is also great mobility, and this sword is very versatile for basically every PvP build. Cons of this sword are that it's very hard to obtain, the Z move can be instinct tricked, and the sword has very high mastery requirements. Overall this sword is perfect, it's excellent for PvP, has great mobility, and excellent for grinding because of its high damage. The Triple Dark Blade, mostly referred as TTY, True Triple Yoru, is one of the 5 mythical swords, and can only be obtained if an admin of the game gives it to you. Pros of this sword are that it deals the highest M1 damage in the entire game, and the AoE of this sword is insane, as it's basically the Dark Blade AoE times by 3. Cons of this sword are that it's insanely hard to get, like 99.98% of normal players will never get this sword, only high-rank YouTubers / mods and friends of admins can get this sword. Overall this sword is excellent, it does great damage, insane AoE, and is great for PvP, the only downside being it's near impossible to obtain. And yeah, those are the pros and cons of all the swords in Blox Fruits. If you found this video useful, please make sure to like and subscribe. Anyway, bye.